Sometimes the Pokemon games hide details so obscure that even longtime players never come close to finding them. A sign that shouldn't exist in Fuchsia City, a Pokétch function that acts in ways the game never uses, and two separate items in Sinnoh quietly linked together by a single forgotten script. These odd leftovers sit untouched in the code, relics of ideas the developers edited, moved, or abandoned without fully removing them, leaving behind tiny quirks that only appear if you look in exactly the right place. Tonight, we drift through those useless, obscure Pokemon facts, the small glitches, invisible objects, and hidden quirks buried deep in the data, and the first one starts in the original Pokemon Red and Blue, released in the late 90s in North America. Fuchsia City appears as a straightforward town on the surface, with its Safari Zone entrance and its gym leader Koga waiting inside. But beneath the visible layout, something curious remains from an earlier stage of development. By utilizing walk-through walls functionality that wasn't meant for normal play, you can access a tiny strip of land beyond the northern boundary of the city, a place where players were never intended to stand. This isolated patch of terrain holds nothing visible at first glance, just empty grass tiles that exist outside the designed borders of the map. Yet if you walk to one specific coordinate and press the action button, the game responds with text, displaying the town sign for Fuchsia City as if it were standing right there in front of you. The sign itself is invisible, completely absent from the screen, but the code that defines its existence remains fully functional within the game's memory. This hidden sign was discovered in 2014 by a data miner known as Chicosaurus, who noticed the peculiar placement while examining the internal structure of the game. The sign's text triggers normally, describing Fuchsia City just as the visible sign does elsewhere, but its position suggests that at some point during development, the layout of the town was slightly different. Perhaps the boundaries extended farther north, or perhaps the town's entrance was repositioned during the design process. Whatever the reason, when the developers redesigned Fuchsia City and moved elements around to finalize the map, this sign's code was never deleted. It simply remained there in the data, invisible and inaccessible under normal circumstances, waiting silently for over 15 years before anyone noticed it existed at all. There's something gentle about imagining this sign standing in the void all that time, doing its quiet job even though no one would ever see it, and it leaves a quiet impression once you notice it. And before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The presence of this leftover code reminds us that game development is rarely a straight path from concept to completion. Ideas shift, maps get redrawn, and sometimes pieces of the original vision linger in places no one remembers to clean up. Fuchsia City's invisible sign is harmless, affecting nothing in normal gameplay, but it serves as a small monument to the evolving process that shaped these beloved games. It's easy to think of Pokémon Red and Blue as finished, polished products, but discoveries like this reveal the layers of iteration hidden underneath. Every town, every route, every building went through drafts and revisions, and occasionally, those earlier drafts left ghosts behind. The invisible sign that doesn't change how we experience the game, but knowing it exists adds a layer of quiet history to Fuchsia City, a whisper of what the town might have been before the final version took shape. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to the 4th generation, where Pokémon Diamond and Pearl introduced the Pokétch, a digital watch worn on the trainer's wrist that held various applications for tracking steps, checking friendship levels, and navigating the region. The Pokétch became an iconic feature of the Sinnoh games, offering practical tools that enhanced the journey through the region. But within the game's data, Researchers have uncovered several unused Pokétch applications that were programmed but never made accessible to players. Most of these unused apps are simple placeholders, empty shells that were likely reserved for ideas that never fully materialized during development. However, one particular unused application stands out for its oddly specific functionality and its seemingly pointless purpose. This app, discovered deep within the ROM files, is essentially nothing more than a light switch. The unused light switch application does exactly what its name suggests. When activated, it displays a simple switch graphic on the Pokétch screen, and when the player taps the switch, it toggles the backlight of the Nintendo DS's bottom screen on and off. The backlight dims completely when turned off, leaving the lower screen dark, and brightens again when switched back on. The application functions perfectly within the code, suggesting it was fully programmed and tested, yet it never appeared in the final game. What makes this especially peculiar is that no other feature in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, or in any other Nintendo DS Pokémon game, ever utilized the bottom screen's backlight as a gameplay mechanic. The backlight was a hardware feature of the DS itself, controlled through the system settings, and there was no precedent for a game to offer manual control over it through an in-game application. The purpose of this light switch app remains a mystery, though several theories have emerged over the years. One possibility is that it was created purely for development purposes, allowing the programmers to test how the game's interface looked with varying levels of screen brightness. Another theory suggests it might have been an early accessibility feature intended to help players conserve battery life by dimming the screen during long play sessions. However, the fact that it was tied to a Pokétch app rather than a system-level setting makes this explanation less likely. It's also possible that the developers simply thought it would be a fun, quirky addition to the Pokétch's collection of apps, a small novelty that players could toggle for no real reason other than amusement. Whatever the intent, the Light Switch app never made it to the final version, and it now exists only as a curiosity within the game's unused data, a small oddity that raises more questions than it answers. There's something oddly charming about the idea of a completely useless Pokétch application sitting in the code, ready to dim the screen for no practical purpose. It reflects the experimental nature of game development, where ideas get tested and sometimes discarded without much fanfare. The Light Switch app didn't enhance gameplay or solve any problems, but someone took the time to program it, to design its simple interface, and to make it fully functional. That effort, however small, is preserved in the game's data, a quiet testament to the creative process that shaped Diamond and Pearl. Even the ideas that didn't make the cut carry a certain charm, reminding us that not every feature needs to serve a grand purpose. Sometimes, a light switch is just a light switch, and that's enough. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at Pokémon Platinum, the enhanced version of Diamond and Pearl that released in 2008 in Japan and 2009 elsewhere. Platinum refined many aspects of the Sinnoh games, adding new areas, adjusting Pokémon availability, and polishing the overall experience. But hidden within its data is a peculiar programming anomaly that went unnoticed for years, until a dedicated fan named Palmer6 discovered it while examining the game's ROM files. Palmer6 shared this finding on social media, explaining that they had been exploring the internal structure of Platinum's map data when they stumbled upon something unusual involving two seemingly unrelated items in completely different locations. These two items, both red shards, are scattered across the Sinnoh region in places that have no obvious connection to each other, yet they share something strange beneath the surface. The first red shard is located in Wayward Cave, a dark, labyrinthine area beneath Route 206 that requires careful navigation and the use of hidden move flash to see clearly. This particular red shard is hidden behind a rock near two NPC hikers, invisible to the player until they use the dowsing machine app on their Pokétch to detect it. The second red shard sits along the mountain path of Route 207, an outdoor area that connects Orberg City to Mount Coronet. This shard is also hidden, requiring the same detection method to find. On the Oceanisat surface, these two red shards seem identical to dozens of other hidden items scattered throughout the game, small treasures that reward thorough exploration. But Palmer 6's discovery revealed that these two shards are not simply copies of the same item type placed in different locations. They are, in a programming sense, the exact same item. When the game's code is examined closely, it becomes clear that both red shards are linked to a single programming script. In most cases, each item in a Pokémon game has its own unique identifier and script, even if the items are functionally identical. Two hidden potions in different areas would each have separate entries in the game's data, allowing the player to collect both independently. But the red shards in Wayward Cave and Route 207 break this pattern. They share the same script ID, meaning that when the player collects one of them, the game registers that script as activated, and the other shard simultaneously disappears. It's as if the two items are connected by an invisible thread, and picking up one causes the other to vanish from the game world. This is the only known instance in Pokémon Platinum where two items in different locations behave as a single entity. The reason for this strange duplication remains unclear, and it's likely an oversight that occurred during the game's development. Perhaps the developers initially placed the red shard in one location, then moved it to another during testing, but forgot to remove the original placement from the code. Alternatively, it could be a remnant of an earlier design choice that was later changed, leaving both instances in the data without anyone noticing the conflict. Whatever the cause, the result is a harmless but baffling quirk that affects nothing in normal gameplay. Most players would never collect both shards in quick succession or even realize they had vanished, since red shards are minor items used for trading with the shard collector on Route 212. The duplication only becomes apparent when examining the game's internal structure, where the shared script reveals itself as a quiet anomaly. Slowly, the story widens as we consider how these small programming oddities accumulate across the series. Each Pokémon game contains thousands of lines of code, countless items, and intricate systems that interact in complex ways. With so much data to manage, it's inevitable that a few strange connections slip through unnoticed. The dual red shard and platinum is a reminder that even the most polished games carry traces of their development history, little imperfections that don't affect the experience but add a layer of curiosity for those who dig deep enough. These quirks don't diminish the quality of the games. Instead, they humanize the process, showing that even experienced developers sometimes leave threads loose or forget to clean up after a change. There's comfort in knowing that perfection isn't required for something to be beloved. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to another unusual discovery, this time involving the mechanics of Pokémon FireRed and LeafGreen, the Generation 3 remakes of the original Kanto games. These remakes brought Red and Blue's world into the Game Boy Advance era, updating graphics, adding new features, and refining the gameplay while staying faithful to the spirit of the originals. One of the many small details in these games involves the move learning patterns of certain Pokémon, which were carefully designed to match their behavior from earlier generations. However, a fan named Gabby, who was working on a ROM hack of FireRed and LeafGreen, discovered something strange while examining the move data for Dugtrio, the three-headed ground-type Pokémon that evolves from Diglett. According to official sources like Bulbapedia, Dugtrio learns two early game moves upon evolution: Scratch and Sand Attack. These moves are listed in that order for both FireRed and LeafGreen, and for most players, this detail goes unnoticed since Dugtrio typically evolves at level 26, long after these moves would be relevant in battle. But Gabby's investigation revealed that the move order is not consistent between the two versions. In Pokemon Leaf Green, Dugtrio learns Sand Attack first, followed by Scratch, while in Pokemon Fire Red, the order is reversed, with Scratch coming before Sand Attack. This subtle difference is not reflected in most official databases, which list the moves in a standardized order without noting the version-specific variation. The discrepancy only becomes apparent when examining the raw data within each game's ROM files. The reason for this inconsistency is a mystery, and it's unclear whether it was an intentional choice or an accidental oversight. Fire Red and Leaf Green were developed simultaneously, and while they share most of their data, small differences were intentionally programmed into each version to encourage trading and give players a reason to experience both games. However, these differences typically involve Pokémon availability, item locations, and minor story variations, not the order in which a single Pokémon learns its moves. The reversed move order for Dugtrio serves no apparent gameplay purpose, and it's unlikely that any player would notice the difference without directly comparing the two versions. It's possible that the move data was entered manually for each version, and a simple mistake occurred during the process, or perhaps the data was copied from different source files that had conflicting information. Whatever the cause, the result is a harmless quirk that affects only one Pokémon in a very minor way. Dugtrio's battle effectiveness remains unchanged, and the order in which it learns Scratch and Sand Attack has no meaningful impact on how players use the Pokémon. Yet, the existence of this discrepancy adds another layer of curiosity to the development of Fire Red and Leaf Green. It's easy to assume that every detail in a Pokémon game is carefully planned and consistent, but discoveries like this reveal the human element behind the code. Someone, somewhere, entered Dugtrio's move data into two separate files, and for reasons we may never fully understand, the order ended up different. That small inconsistency has persisted in the games ever since, a quiet reminder that even the most polished titles carry traces of the messy, iterative process that brought them into existence. Before we continue this gentle journey, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these small oddities connect across the series. Each generation of Pokémon games introduces new mechanics, new regions, and new Pokémon, but beneath the surface they all share a common thread of development quirks and leftover ideas. From invisible signs in Kanto to unused Pokétch apps in Sinnoh, from dual red shards in Platinum to reversed move orders in Fire Red and Leaf Green, these details paint a picture of a series that has been shaped by countless hands over decades. The fact that fans continue to discover these oddities years after the game's release speaks to the depth and complexity of Pokémon's code, and to the dedication of the community that keeps exploring even the most obscure corners of these virtual worlds. As we drift a little further into tonight's journey, we can explore another layer of hidden content, this time involving a game that most people wouldn't immediately associate with Pokémon. In 2013, a game called Pocket Card Jockey was released for the Nintendo 3DS, a curious blend of solitaire-style card gameplay and horse racing simulation. The game was developed by Game Freak, the same studio behind the Pokémon series, and while Pocket Card Jockey has no official connection to Pokémon, its developers couldn't resist including a few playful references to their most famous franchise. These references are subtle, hidden within the names of the racing horses that populate the game's roster, and they serve as quiet nods to the series that made Game Freak a household name. One of the horses in Pocket Card Jockey is named Pika Pika Mouse, a clear reference to Pikachu, whose name derives from the Japanese words for the sound of electricity, Pika, and the sound a mouse makes, Chew. Another horse is named Juniper, after Professor Juniper, the Pokemon professor who appears in Pokemon Black and White. There's also a horse called Sylph Company, referencing the Sylph Company from the Kanto region, the corporation responsible for creating the Master Ball and other advanced technology in the Pokemon world. Two additional horses are named Silver Soul and Gold Heart, clear nods to Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver, the Generation 4 remakes of the Johto games. These references are scattered throughout Pocket Card Jockey's roster, blending seamlessly into the game's quirky aesthetic without drawing explicit attention to themselves. The inclusion of these Pokemon references in Pocket Card Jockey reflects Game Freak's sense of humor and their willingness to acknowledge their flagship series even in unrelated projects. Pocket Card Jockey is a strange niche game that combines two seemingly incompatible genres, and its development team clearly had fun with the concept. By sneaking in these subtle nods to Pokemon, they created a sense of continuity between their projects, a reminder that even when working on something completely different, the spirit of Pokemon is never far from their minds. For fans who noticed these references, they served as delightful Easter eggs, small moments of recognition that connected Pocket Card Jockey to the larger world of Game Freak's creative output. There's a quiet charm in discovering these hidden connections, in realizing that the developers couldn't help but leave traces of Pokemon in a game about horse racing. It's a reminder that the people who create these games are fans themselves, deeply attached to the worlds they've built over the years. Even when working on a side project, they found ways to honor the series that defined their careers. The horse names in Pocket Card Jockey don't affect gameplay or add any meaningful content, but they exist as a gentle gesture, a wink to the audience that says, "We see you and we appreciate that you notice these details." That sense of connection, however small, is part of what makes exploring Pokemon's extended universe so rewarding. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, this time involving a peculiar glitch related to the location data stored in a Pokemon's summary screen. When you catch or receive a Pokemon in these games, the summary screen records where the Pokemon was obtained, displaying a met location that serves as a memento of where your journey with that Pokemon began. This feature adds a personal touch to each member of your team, allowing you to remember the circumstances of your first encounter. However, a strange quirk exists in how this location data behaves when you obtain a Pokemon within Celadon City, specifically in relation to the Celadon department store. To demonstrate this glitch, you first need to obtain a Pokemon while inside Celadon City itself. This can be done by purchasing an Abra from the Celadon Game Corner, receiving the gift Eevee from an NPC in one of the city's buildings, or hatching an egg while standing within the city limits. Any method works as long as the Pokemon's met location registers as Celadon City. Once you have this Pokemon in your party, walk into the Celadon department store, the large multi-floor shopping center in the western part of the city. Open the Pokemon's summary screen while inside the store, and you'll notice something strange. The Met location, which previously displayed Celadon City, has now changed to Celadon Department Store. The business game has temporarily overridden the location data, updating it to reflect your current position within the building. This behavior is unusual because the Met location is supposed to be a permanent record of where the Pokemon was originally obtained, not a dynamic field that changes based on your current location. The glitch suggests that the game's code is checking the player's position and updating the location text in real time, rather than simply displaying the stored value. What makes this even stranger is that the change is not permanent. As soon as you step outside the Celadon department store, the Met location reverts back to Celadon City, as if nothing had happened. The glitch only occurs while you're physically inside the building, and it affects any Pokémon that was obtained within Celadon City, regardless of the specific method used to acquire it. Curious to see if it was possible to make the Celadon department store location permanent, some players have tried hatching eggs directly inside the building, reasoning that if the Pokémon is obtained while the player is in the department store, the game might lock in that location as the Met data. However, even when hatching an egg inside the store, the location behaves the same way. The summary screen displays Celadon department store while inside, but as soon as the player steps outside, the location changes to Celadon City. The game appears to be programmed in such a way that Celadon City is treated as the overarching location, with the department store functioning as a temporary sublocation that only appears in certain contexts. This glitch is harmless and doesn't affect gameplay in any meaningful way, but it adds a layer of oddity to how location data is handled in FireRed and LeafGreen. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, small glitches that don't break the game, but reveal the intricate systems working beneath the surface. The Celadon department store location glitch is a reminder that even simple features like the Met location involve complex programming logic, with checks and overrides that can sometimes produce unexpected results. The developers likely intended for the department store to be recognized as a distinct location, but the implementation ended up creating a situation where the location text flickers between two values depending on where the player is standing. It's a small imperfection, but it's one that adds character to the game, a quirk that makes the world feel a little more alive and unpredictable. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver, the Generation 4 remakes of the Johto games that introduced a beloved feature, walking Pokémon. In these games, the first Pokémon in your party follows you around as you explore the region, appearing as a visible sprite on the overworld map. This feature added a new level of immersion and companionship to the journey, allowing players to see their Pokémon react to different environments and interact with the world in small ways. What many players don't realize is that the walking Pokémon feature includes an extensive system of specialized dialogue that changes based on numerous factors, including the species of the Pokémon, the location you're in, and even where the Pokémon was originally caught. Each Pokémon has unique lines of dialogue that appear when you interact with it while it's following you, and these lines are carefully tailored to reflect the Pokémon's personality and the context of your current location. For example, Chikorita, one of the Johto starter Pokémon, has a special line of dialogue that appears when you're on Route 30, the very first route in the game. This line is unique to Chikorita and doesn't appear for the other starter Pokémon, Cyndaquil or Totodile. The dialogue system is so detailed that even non-starter Pokémon have location-specific interactions. The Electrode Pokémon that appear in the Team Rocket hideout, for instance, have exclusive dialogue that only triggers when you're on the second basement floor where you caught them, as if the Pokémon remembers the place where it joined your team. The dialogue system extends even further, with certain Pokémon reacting differently depending on whether they were caught in a specific area or simply brought there later. Some Pokémon will display nostalgic lines if you return them to their original capture location, while others have reactions tied to thematic elements of the environment. The system is so intricate that data miners have uncovered hundreds of unique dialogue strings hidden within the game's code, many of which players would never encounter without deliberately testing different Pokémon in different locations. This level of detail reflects the care and effort that went into making the walking Pokémon feature feel personal and meaningful, transforming it from a simple visual novelty into a dynamic system that deepens the bond between player and Pokémon. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing that this level of detail exists, even if most players will never see all of it. The walking Pokemon dialogue system in HeartGold and SoulSilver represents a commitment to creating a world that feels alive and responsive, where your choices and your journey are reflected in the small interactions you have along the way. It's a reminder that the developers of these games understood the emotional connection players have with their Pokemon, and they worked to honor that connection by giving each species its own voice, its own reactions, and its own way of experiencing the world alongside you. These small moments of recognition, where your Pikachu reacts to a thunderstorm or your Lapras feels at home near water, are what make the Pokemon series feel so personal and enduring. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Another layer of hidden content reveals itself when we turn to the competitive side of Pokemon, specifically the mechanics of breeding and the subtle ways certain traits are passed down through generations. In the mainline Pokemon games, breeding has always been a complex system with numerous hidden variables, and one of the most obscure elements involves the way certain moves are inherited. While most players are familiar with egg moves, which are special moves that baby Pokemon can learn from their parents, there are even deeper layers to this system that involve gender, species compatibility, and the specific mechanics of how moves are prioritized during the breeding process. These details are so intricate that even experienced breeders sometimes discover new interactions years after mastering the basics. One particularly obscure aspect of breeding involves the interaction between Ditto and genderless Pokémon. Ditto is unique in the Pokémon world because it can breed with almost any Pokémon, regardless of gender or egg group, making it an invaluable tool for breeders. However, when Ditto breeds with a genderless Pokémon, like Magnemite or Staryu, the resulting egg always belongs to the non-Ditto species, and the baby inherits no moves from Ditto itself. This seems straightforward on the surface, but the mechanics become strange when you consider that Ditto, despite being able to breed with genderless Pokémon, cannot pass down any genetic information beyond the species type. In practical terms, this means that Ditto functions purely as a surrogate, contributing nothing to the offspring except the ability for the egg to exist in the first place. This limitation becomes even more apparent when you examine the move inheritance rules for genderless Pokémon. Since genderless Pokémon have no traditional gender binary, they cannot pass down egg moves in the same way that gendered Pokémon can. When two Magnemite breed, for example, the resulting baby Magnemite will know only the moves it would naturally learn at level 1, with no ability to inherit special moves from its parents. The only way to obtain a genderless Pokémon with specific egg moves is to breed a genderless species with Ditto while ensuring that the genderless parent knows the desired moves through leveling, TMs, or move tutors before breeding. This creates a strange paradox where Ditto is essential for breeding genderless Pokémon, yet contributes nothing to the offspring's moveset, making it a passive facilitator rather than an active genetic contributor. The mechanics of breeding become even more intricate when considering how moves are prioritized when both parents know overlapping moves. In Generation 4 and earlier, if both parents knew the same egg move, the baby would inherit that move, but the order in which the baby learned its moves could vary depending on which parent was placed in the daycare first. This subtle detail affected how breeding chains were constructed, since players needed to carefully plan the order of their breeding pairs to ensure that the desired moves appeared in the correct slots. Later generations streamlined this process, making move inheritance more predictable, but the early complexity of the system left many players confused about why their breeding results didn't match their expectations. There's a quiet beauty in how these breeding mechanics reflect the broader design philosophy of Pokémon. On the surface, breeding seems simple. Put two compatible Pokémon together, wait for an egg, and hatch a new baby. But beneath that simplicity lies a web of interconnected rules and exceptions that reward deep understanding and careful planning. The interactions between Ditto and genderless Pokémon, the prioritization of egg moves, and the subtle differences between generations all contribute to a system that is both accessible to casual players and endlessly complex for those who want to master it. These hidden layers are part of what keeps players engaged with Pokémon long after they've completed the main story, offering a challenge that extends far beyond simply catching them all. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the way certain Pokémon types interact with environmental hazards in the overworld. While most players are familiar with how type matchups work in battle, fewer realize that some types have special interactions with the environment outside of combat. For example, in Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, if you have a Pokémon with the ability Magma Armor or Flame Body in your party, eggs in your party will hatch twice as fast. This is a well-known mechanic among breeders, but what's less commonly discussed is that this effect is tied specifically to the ability, not to the Pokémon's type. A Fire-type Pokémon without Magma Armor or Flame Body will not speed up egg hatching, while a non-Fire-type Pokémon with one of these abilities will. This distinction becomes important when considering how abilities were designed to interact with the overworld in subtle ways. Game Freak has always included small quality-of-life features that reward players for paying attention to their team composition, and the egg hatching abilities are a perfect example. They serve no purpose in battle, existing solely to make the breeding process more efficient, and they encourage players to keep specific Pokémon in their party even when they're not actively using them in combat. This design philosophy extends to other abilities as well. Pokémon with Illuminate increase the encounter rate in wild grass, while Pokémon with Arena Trap prevent wild Pokémon from fleeing. These abilities create a layer of strategic depth that extends beyond battles, making team composition relevant even when you're just walking through routes or exploring caves. The way these abilities interact with the overworld also reflects the developer's attention to thematic consistency. Magma Armor and Flame Body both involve heat, so it makes logical sense that they would speed up the incubation process for eggs. Similarly, Illuminate creates light, which attracts wild Pokémon, and Arena Trap prevents escape, which logically translates to keeping wild encounters from running away. These connections between ability effects and their real-world logic help the Pokémon world feel cohesive and thoughtfully designed, even in areas where gameplay mechanics could have been arbitrary. The fact that players can discover these interactions through experimentation without explicit tutorials adds to the sense of exploration and discovery that defines the series. Slowly, the story widens as we consider how these mechanical details accumulate across the series. Each generation of Pokémon introduces new abilities, new types, and new ways for Pokémon to interact with the world, and with each edition, the web of possible interactions becomes more intricate. The egg hatching abilities in Generation 3 set a precedent for overworld ability effects, which later generations expanded upon with abilities like Pickup, Honey Gather, and Frisk. These abilities don't change the core gameplay, but they add texture and variety to how players experience the journey, rewarding those who pay attention to the smaller details and experiment with different team compositions. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to another layer of obscure knowledge, this time involving the way certain items behave in specific contexts. Pokemon games are filled with items, from basic potions and Pokeballs to rare held items and key items that unlock new areas. Most of these items function exactly as their descriptions suggest, but a few have hidden properties or unusual interactions that aren't immediately obvious. One such example involves the Soothe Bell, a held item introduced in Generation 3 that increases the rate at which a Pokemon's friendship grows. Friendship, also known as happiness, is a hidden stat that affects various gameplay elements, including the power of certain moves like Return and Frustration, and the evolution of Pokemon like Golbat and Chansey. The Soothe Bell works by multiplying the friendship points gained from various actions, such as walking, leveling up, or using vitamins, making it an essential tool for players who want to evolve friendship-based Pokemon quickly. However, what many players don't realize is that the Soothe Bell's effect stacks with other friendship-boosting mechanics in complex ways. For example, in Generation 4, Pokemon caught in a luxury ball gain friendship faster than Pokemon caught in standard Pokeballs, and if a Pokemon caught in a luxury ball also holds a Soothe Bell, the two effects multiply rather than simply adding together. This means that a Pokemon caught in a luxury ball and holding a Soothe Bell will gain friendship significantly faster than a Pokemon with only one of those boosts. The interaction between the luxury ball and Soothe Bell creates an optimal strategy for raising friendship quickly, but the mechanics are never explained in-game, leaving players to discover the synergy through experimentation or external research. This is a recurring theme in Pokemon's design. The games provide basic tools and hints, but the deepest strategies and most efficient methods are left for the community to uncover. The Soothe Bell and Luxury Ball interaction is just one example of how seemingly simple mechanics can hide layers of complexity that reward careful observation and testing. For players who take the time to understand these systems, the game becomes more manageable, but for those who don't, the mechanics remain mysterious and slightly frustrating. There's a quiet satisfaction in discovering these hidden interactions and realizing that the game is more intricate than it first appears. The Soothe Bell and Luxury Ball synergy doesn't fundamentally change how friendship works, but it offers a tangible reward for players who pay attention to the details and think critically about how different mechanics might interact. This design philosophy encourages experimentation and rewards curiosity, creating a sense of discovery that extends beyond simply following a linear path. It's a reminder that Pokemon games are designed with layers, offering different experiences depending on how deeply you choose to engage with them. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the way certain moves interact with specific abilities in unexpected ways. While most type matchups and ability interactions are straightforward and predictable, a few edge cases exist where the mechanics behave in counterintuitive ways. One such example involves the move Volt Absorb and its interaction with the move Thunder Wave. Volt Absorb is an ability that allows a Pokemon to heal HP when hit by an electric-type move, rather than taking damage. This makes sense for damaging electric-type moves like Thunderbolt or Discharge, but Thunder Wave is a status move that doesn't deal damage, so logically, it shouldn't trigger Volt Absorb at all. However, in certain generations, Thunder Wave does trigger Volt Absorb, but instead of healing the target or dealing damage, the move simply fails. This creates a strange situation where a status move is blocked by an ability designed to interact with damaging moves, even though the ability's effect doesn't apply in a meaningful way. The interaction is harmless and doesn't break the game, but it highlights the complexity of how abilities and moves are programmed to interact with each other. The code checks for the move's type before determining whether it can be used, and since Thunderwave is an electric-type move, Volt Absorb flags it as something that should be absorbed, even though there's no damage to heal from. This edge case becomes even more interesting when you consider that similar abilities, like Water Absorb and Flash Fire, behave consistently with Volt Absorb. Water Absorb blocks non-damaging Water-type moves, and Flash Fire blocks non-damaging Fire-type moves, creating a pattern where type-absorbing abilities prevent all moves of that type, not just damaging ones. This design choice suggests that the developers prioritized consistency in how abilities interact with move types, even if it means that certain interactions produce outcomes that seem counterintuitive. The result is a system where abilities function predictably once you understand the underlying rules, but where those rules can sometimes lead to outcomes that feel slightly odd on the surface. There's a quiet elegance in how these mechanics balance consistency and intuition. The Volt Absorb and Thunderwave interaction doesn't make immediate logical sense, but it follows a clear rule that applies across all type-absorbing abilities. This consistency makes the system easier to understand once you grasp the underlying principle, but it also means that players need to think critically about how abilities and moves interact, rather than relying solely on intuition. It's another example of how Pokémon rewards deep understanding, offering layers of complexity that become clearer the more you engage with the systems. Before we move deeper, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these mechanical details connect to the broader experience of playing Pokémon. Each of these obscure facts, whether it's a breeding quirk, an ability interaction, or a hidden item property, contributes to a sense of depth that makes the games feel endlessly explorable. Even after finishing the main story, catching all the Pokémon, and defeating the Elite Four, there's always more to discover, more to test, and more to understand. This depth is part of what keeps players coming back to Pokémon year after year, finding new ways to engage with systems they thought they had mastered. As we drift a little further into tonight's journey, we can explore another layer of hidden content, this time involving the way certain NPCs in the games reference obscure details from Pokémon lore. Throughout the series, various NPCs provide hints, tips, and flavor text that add personality to the world, but some of these lines contain subtle references to mechanics or concepts that most players would never think to investigate. For example, in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, an NPC in Canalave City mentions that Pokémon and humans used to eat at the same table, a reference to a piece of lore found in the Canalave Library that describes ancient times when the boundaries between humans and Pokémon were less defined. This library lore is one of the darker aspects of Pokémon's world building, hinting at a time when humans and Pokémon were more similar, and possibly even interbred. The text is intentionally vague, leaving much to interpretation, but it adds a layer of depth to the Pokémon world that extends beyond the cheerful adventures of the main games. The NPC's reference to eating at the same table is subtle enough that most players wouldn't connect it to the library lore, but for those who take the time to explore and read all the available text, it serves as a quiet acknowledgement of the series' deeper mythology. These small details are scattered throughout the games, rewarding players who pay attention and encouraging them to seek out every bit of dialogue and every piece of lore. Another example of this type of NPC reference appears in Pokémon Black and White, where an NPC in Castelia City mentions that Pokémon used to live in harmony with humans before Pokéballs were invented. This line connects to a broader theme in the Unova games, which explore the ethics of capturing and training other Pokémon through the antagonist group Team Plasma. The NPC's comment is a subtle nod to this theme, suggesting that the invention of Pokeballs fundamentally changed the relationship between humans and Pokémon, for better or worse. The game doesn't dwell on this idea, leaving it as a background detail for players to consider, but it adds weight to Team Plasma's philosophy and makes their arguments feel more grounded in the world's history. These NPC references are easy to miss, blending into the background chatter of the game, but they serve an important role in making the Pokémon world feel lived in and thoughtful. The developers could have filled the games with generic dialogue that simply provided gameplay tips or flavor, but instead, they chose to include lines that connect to deeper lore, create thematic resonance, and reward players who engage with the world beyond the surface level. This attention to detail is part of what makes Pokémon feel like a cohesive universe, rather than just a collection of mechanics and battles. Every NPC, every piece of text, and every environmental detail contributes to a sense of place and history that enriches the overall experience. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, small interactions with NPCs that hint at larger stories and deeper meanings. The Pokémon series has always balanced its lighthearted, accessible surface with a surprisingly complex undercurrent of lore and mythology, and these NPC references are one of the ways that balance is maintained. They don't demand attention or disrupt the flow of the game, but they're there for players who want to dig deeper, offering glimpses into a world that extends far beyond the routes and cities you explore during your journey. Another layer of hidden content reveals itself when we turn to the way certain Pokémon appearances change between different games or versions. While most Pokémon maintain a consistent design across the series, a few have subtle variations that are easy to overlook. One example involves the way Unown's forms are distributed across different games. Unown is a Psychic-type Pokémon introduced in Generation 2, known for its 28 different forms, each representing a letter of the alphabet or a punctuation mark. In Pokémon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, all 28 forms of Unown are available, but the distribution of which forms appear depends on the Ruins of Alph puzzle you've completed. What many players don't realize is that the Unown forms are not evenly distributed, and certain forms are significantly rarer than others. The exclamation point and question mark forms, which were added in Pokémon Crystal, can only be encountered after completing specific puzzles and require additional steps to access. This makes them much rarer than the letter forms, and many players who casually explored the Ruins of Alph never encountered them at all. The rarity of these forms was intentional, designed to reward players who fully completed the Ruins of Alph content, but the game never explicitly tells you that these forms exist or how to unlock them, leaving it as a hidden challenge for dedicated players to discover. The Unown distribution system also ties into the game's broader design philosophy of encouraging thoroughness and exploration. The Ruins of Alph are optional content, and many players pass through the area without solving all the puzzles or catching all the unknown forms. But for those who take the time to engage with the puzzles, decode the ancient text, and explore every corner of the ruins, the game offers the satisfaction of completing a hidden collection and encountering forms that most players will never see. This design choice reflects the developer's belief that not every piece of content needs to be accessible to everyone. Some rewards are reserved for those who go the extra mile. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing that these rare Unown forms exist, even if you never personally encountered them. The Ruins of Alph represent a type of content that has become rarer in modern Pokémon games. Optional areas that require patience, observation, and problem solving to fully explore. The puzzles aren't difficult, but they demand attention and effort, and the reward is not a powerful Pokemon or a valuable item, but simply the knowledge that you've seen something most players haven't. This type of content appeals to a specific type of player, one who values completion and discovery over efficiency, and it adds depth to the game for those who seek it out. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to another layer of obscure knowledge, this time involving the way certain moves have hidden effects that aren't described in their in-game text. Most moves in Pokémon have straightforward effects. They deal damage, inflict status conditions, or change stats. However, a few moves have secondary effects that are either poorly explained or not explained at all, leaving players to discover them through experimentation or external research. One such example involves the move Knockoff, a dark-type move that deals damage and removes the target's held item for the remainder of the battle. Knockoff's primary effect is well known among competitive players, but what's less commonly discussed is that the move's power increases significantly if the target is holding an item. In Generation 6, Knockoff's base power was increased from 65 to 97 when used against a target holding an item, making it one of the most powerful Dark-type moves in the game under the right circumstances. However, this power boost is not mentioned in the move's in-game description, which only states that the move knocks off the target's item. Players who never looked up the move's detailed mechanics would have no way of knowing that Knockoff is significantly stronger against targets holding items, leading many to underestimate its competitive value. This hidden power boost is an example of how Pokemon's mechanics are often more complex than they appear on the surface. The game provides basic information about each move, but the full details are left for players to discover through testing, research, or consultation with external resources like Bulbapedia or Smogon. This design choice creates a divide between casual players, who rely solely on in-game information, and competitive players, who actively seek out detailed mechanics and optimize their strategies based on that knowledge. For casual players, Knockoff is a decent move that removes items. For competitive players, it's a powerhouse that combines utility with high damage output. The gap between in-game descriptions and actual mechanics is a recurring theme in Pokémon, and it's one that has drawn criticism from some parts of the community. Players argue that important information like Knockoff's power boost should be clearly communicated in the game itself, rather than hidden in external databases. However, others appreciate the sense of discovery that comes from uncovering these details, arguing that the lack of explicit information encourages experimentation and rewards players who take the time to deeply understand the systems. This tension between clarity and mystery is part of what defines Pokemon's design philosophy, and it's unlikely to be fully resolved as long as the series continues to balance accessibility with depth. There's a quiet elegance in how these hidden mechanics reward engagement and curiosity. The Knockoff power boost doesn't fundamentally change the game for casual players, who can still complete the main story without knowing about it, but it adds a layer of strategic depth for those who seek it out. This layered design allows the Pokémon to appeal to a wide audience, offering a simple, accessible experience for newcomers while providing endless complexity for veterans. The fact that players are still discovering and discussing these mechanical nuances decades after the game's release speaks to the enduring appeal of Pokémon's systems and the community's dedication to mastering them. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the way certain Pokémon have version-exclusive move tutor options that affect their competitive viability. Move tutors are NPCs who teach specific moves to Pokémon in exchange for items, and they've been a staple of the series since Generation 3. However, the moves available through tutors vary between games, and certain Pokémon can only learn specific moves through tutors in particular versions. This creates a situation where a Pokemon's moveset options are limited not by its natural learn set or TM compatibility, but by which game it was trained in. One example of this involves the move Stealth Rock, a rock-type move that sets up entry hazards which damage opposing Pokemon when they switch in. Stealth Rock is one of the most important moves in competitive play, and many Pokemon that would benefit from learning it have no way to do so through level up or TMs. In Generation 4, Stealth Rock was available as a move tutor move in Pokemon Platinum, but not in Diamond or Pearl. This meant that certain Pokemon could only learn Stealth Rock if they were trained in Platinum and then transferred to Diamond or Pearl for competitive battles. The version exclusivity of move tutors created a barrier for players who only owned one game, forcing them to either trade with friends or purchase multiple versions to access the full range of competitive options. This design choice reflects the series' long-standing emphasis on trading and connectivity as core features. Pokemon has always encouraged players to interact with each other, whether through trading to complete the Pokédex, battling to test their teams, or sharing move tutor Pokemon to help friends access exclusive moves. The version exclusivity of move tutors reinforces this philosophy, making it difficult for solo players to fully optimize their teams without engaging with the broader community. For some players, this creates a sense of frustration as competitive viability becomes tied to access and resources rather than purely skill and strategy. For others, it adds to the social experience of Pokemon, creating opportunities for collaboration and trade. The move tutor system has evolved over the generations, with later games making more moves available across all versions and reducing the barriers to accessing competitive options. However, the legacy of version-exclusive tutors still lingers in older generations, affecting how certain Pokemon are built and transferred. This history is a reminder that Pokemon's design has always been shaped by its multiplayer philosophy, prioritizing connectivity and interaction even at the cost of solo player convenience. For better or worse, this approach has defined the series and contributed to the sense of community that surrounds it. Slowly, the story widens as we consider how these version-exclusive mechanics accumulate across the series. Each generation introduces new moves, new tutors, and new ways to customize your Pokémon, but the legacy systems from earlier games create layers of complexity that affect how Pokémon are trained and transferred. A Pokémon caught in Generation 3 might have access to moves that are no longer available in later generations, making it a valuable asset for Copa competitive play. Similarly, certain Pokémon can only reach their full potential by being trained across multiple games and generations, passed from one version to another to collect the full range of moves they need. This cross-generational complexity is both a strength and a weakness of Pokemon's design, offering depth and history while also creating barriers for new players. As we drift a little further into tonight's journey, we can explore another layer of hidden content, this time involving the way certain in-game events are triggered by obscure conditions that most players would never think to test. Pokemon games are filled with optional events and encounters that require specific actions to unlock, and while some of these are telegraphed through NPC hints or environmental clues, others are hidden so deeply that they were only discovered through data mining or community collaboration. One such example involves the event to encounter Regigigas in Pokemon Platinum. To encounter Regigigas in Platinum, you need to have all three of the Regi Pokemon, Regirock, Regisi, and Registeel, in your party. However, these three Pokemon are not available in Platinum itself. They can only be obtained by transferring them from Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald through the Pal Park feature. Once you have all three Regis in your party, you need to visit the Snow Point Temple and interact with a specific statue deep within the temple. The game provides no hints about this process. No NPC mentions the requirement, and there's no environmental clue that suggests the Regis are involved. The only way to discover this event is through external research, community discussion, or sheer trial and error. The Regigigas event is an example of how Pokémon sometimes hides content behind opaque requirements that reward players who engage deeply with the games and the community. The developers knew that players would share information online, discuss strategies, and collaborate to uncover secrets, and they designed certain events with that expectation in mind. For players who engage with online communities, the Regigigas event is a fun challenge that requires planning and cross-generational trading. For players who don't, it's an event they'll likely never experience, a hidden piece of content that remains invisible unless someone tells them about it. This design philosophy has become less common in more recent Pokémon games, which tend to provide clearer hints and more accessible event triggers. However, the legacy of events like Regigigas lives on in the community's memory, representing a time when Pokémon was willing to hide content behind significant barriers and trust that players would find it anyway. For some, this approach was frustrating, locking away content behind requirements that felt arbitrary and inaccessible. For others, it was part of what made Pokémon feel special, a game that rewarded dedication and community engagement rather than simply handing everything to the player. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that these hidden events exist, even if you never personally triggered them. The Regigigas event represents a type of content that values discovery and collaboration over convenience, and it reflects a design philosophy that trusts players to share information and help each other. This philosophy has shaped the Pokémon community in fundamental ways, creating a culture of knowledge sharing and collective problem solving that extends far beyond the games themselves. The fact that players still discuss these events years later, sharing strategies and reminiscing about the process of discovery, speaks to the lasting impact of this design approach. Another layer of hidden content reveals itself when we turn to the way certain Pokémon have hidden stats or properties that affect their battle performance in ways that aren't immediately visible. One such property is the gender ratio of each species, which determines the likelihood of encountering a male or female individual when catching or breeding. Most Pokémon have a 50-50 gender ratio, making males and females equally common, but many species deviate from this norm in ways that affect their availability and competitive viability. For example, starter Pokémon have a gender ratio of 87.5% male and 12.5% female, making female starters significantly rarer than males. This ratio was likely chosen to make breeding starters more challenging, since you need a female to pass down the species when breeding with non-Ditto partners. The rarity of female starters creates a small economy within the trading community, where female starter Pokémon are considered more valuable than their male counterparts. This dynamic is never explained in-game, and many casual players complete entire playthroughs without realizing that their starter's gender affects its breeding potential or trade value. The gender ratio system extends beyond starters, affecting dozens of species in ways that range from minor inconveniences to significant competitive considerations. Pokémon like Eevee and Riolu have the same 87.5% male ratio as starters, making it difficult to breed them without Ditto. Other Pokémon, like Salandit, have gender-locked evolutions, where only females can evolve into Salazzle, making female Salandit essential for completing the Pokédex. The game provides no clear indication of these gender restrictions until you attempt to evolve the Pokémon, leaving players to discover the requirement through trial and error. There's a quiet complexity to how these gender ratios interact with the breeding system, creating layers of challenge that reward players who understand the mechanics. The 87.5% male ratio for starters isn't just a random number. It's a carefully chosen value that makes female starters rare enough to feel special without being prohibitively difficult to obtain. Similarly, the gender-locked evolution of Celandit adds a layer of challenge to catching and training the species, encouraging players to be selective about which Celandite they invest time in. These design choices reflect the developer's belief that not every aspect of the game needs to be easy or immediate. Some things are worth working for. Before we continue, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these hidden properties accumulate to create a sense of depth and discovery. Each Pokémon species has dozens of attributes, from base stats and type matchups to gender ratios and evolution methods, and understanding how these attributes interact is part of what makes Pokémon engaging. The gender ratio system is just one example of how the games reward players who pay attention to details and think strategically about their choices. For casual players, gender ratios are an invisible mechanic that rarely matters. For breeders and collectors, they're a crucial consideration that shapes how they approach team building and trading. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can turn our attention to another layer of obscure knowledge, this time involving the way certain items have hidden properties that affect how they interact with specific moves or abilities. One such item is the Focus Sash, a held item that allows a Pokémon to survive a one-hit knockout with 1 HP remaining, as long as the Pokémon is at full health when the attack hits. The Focus Sash is a staple of competitive play, often used to ensure that fragile but powerful Pokémon can survive long enough to execute their strategies. However, what many players don't realize is that the Focus Sash has a hidden interaction with multi-hit moves that affects how reliably it protects the holder. When a Pokémon holding a Focus Sash is hit by a multi-hit move like Rock Blast or Pin Missile, the item activates after the first hit if that hit would otherwise knock out the Pokémon. This allows the Pokémon to survive with 1 HP, but it doesn't prevent the subsequent hits from landing. If any of the remaining hits deal at least 1 damage, the Pokémon will be knocked out despite the Focus Sash activation. This means that multi-hit moves are effective counters to Focus Sash strategies, bypassing the item's protection in a way that single-hit moves cannot. This interaction is never explained in-game, leaving players to discover it through experience or research. The Focus Sash and multi-hit move interaction is an example of how Pokémon's mechanics are designed with competitive balance in mind. The Focus Sash is a powerful item that can turn the tide of battle, but it has clear counterplay options that prevent it from being overpowered. Multi-hit moves, priority moves, and entry hazards all interact with the Focus Sash in ways that create strategic depth, rewarding players who understand these interactions and plan their teams accordingly. For casual players, the Focus Sash is a useful item that occasionally saves a Pokémon from fainting. For competitive players, it's a tool that requires careful consideration and counterplay awareness. There's a quiet elegance in how these item interactions balance utility and vulnerability. The Focus Sash is powerful enough to be worth using, but it has enough weaknesses that it doesn't dominate the competitive landscape. This balance is the result of careful design, where the developers anticipated how players would use the item and created counterplay options to keep it in check. The fact that these interactions are hidden and require discovery adds to the sense of depth, rewarding players who experiment and learn through experience rather than relying solely on in-game descriptions. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the way certain Pokémon have hidden abilities that were added in later generations, but only become available through specific methods. Hidden abilities, introduced in Generation 5, are alternate abilities that certain Pokémon can have instead of their standard abilities. These hidden abilities are often more powerful or situationally useful than the standard options, making them highly sought after for competitive play. However, obtaining a Pokémon with its hidden ability requires specific methods, and the availability of these methods varies between games. In Generation 5, hidden abilities were primarily obtained through the Dream World, an online service that allowed players to catch Pokémon with hidden abilities and transfer them to their games. When the Dream World service was discontinued, many hidden ability Pokémon became unavailable, creating a situation where certain competitive strategies could only be executed with Pokémon that had been obtained years earlier. Later generations introduced new methods for obtaining hidden abilities, such as Friend Safari in Generation 6 and SOS battles in Generation 7, but the discontinuation of the Dream World left a gap in availability that affected competitive play for years. The hidden ability system reflects the series' ongoing tension between accessibility and exclusivity. On one hand, hidden abilities add depth and variety to team building, giving players more options for how to use each species. On the other hand, the methods for obtaining hidden abilities are often time-limited or version exclusive, creating barriers for players who come to the series late or who don't have access to all the games. This tension is part of what makes Pokémon's design so complex and occasionally frustrating. The developers want to reward long-term engagement and provide exclusive content, but they also want the games to be accessible to new players. Balancing these goals is an ongoing challenge that shapes how features like hidden abilities are implemented and distributed. There's a quiet frustration in knowing that certain competitive options are unavailable simply because you didn't play the right game at the right time. The hidden ability system has improved over the generations, with more methods for obtaining these abilities and fewer time-limited exclusives, but the legacy of discontinued services and version-exclusive content still affects how players approach team building. For some, this history adds value to older Pokémon that have hidden abilities from discontinued sources, making them rare and desirable. For others, it's a barrier that makes competitive play feel inaccessible and frustrating. This divide reflects broader questions about how Pokémon should handle legacy content and whether past exclusives should remain exclusive or be made available through new methods. As we drift a little further into tonight's journey, we can explore another layer of hidden content, this time involving the way certain locations in Pokémon games have hidden properties that affect encounter rates or item availability. One example involves the phenomenon of honey trees in Pokémon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, which are special trees scattered throughout the Sinnoh region that can be slathered with honey to attract rare Pokémon. The honey tree system seems straightforward on the surface. Slather honey on a tree, wait 6 hours, and return to see if a Pokémon appeared. However, the actual mechanics behind honey trees are far more complex and opaque than the game suggests. First, not all honey trees are created equal. Out of the 21 honey trees in Sinnoh, 4 are designated as special trees that have a higher chance of attracting rare Pokémon like Heracross and Munchlax. However, which trees are special is determined by the player's Trainer ID and Secret ID, values that are assigned when you start a new game. This means that the location of your special trees is unique to your save file and can't be changed without starting over. The game provides no indication of which trees are special, No NPC mentions the system, and there's no way to identify special trees through normal gameplay. The only way to determine your special trees is through external calculators that use your trainer ID and secret ID to compute the results. The opacity of the honey tree system makes it one of the most frustrating mechanics in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Players who want to catch Munchlax, one of the rarest Pokemon in the game, need to either randomly slather honey on all 21 trees and hope they happen to use a special tree, or they need to consult external resources to identify their special trees and focus their efforts there. The 6-hour waiting period between slathering and checking the tree adds to the frustration, turning what should be an exciting mechanic into a tedious waiting game. Many players give up on catching Munchlax entirely, opting to trade for one instead, or simply ignoring the honey tree system altogether. The honey tree system is a prime example of how Pokemon's design sometimes prioritizes mystery and discovery over player convenience. The developers clearly intended for the special tree mechanic to be a hidden layer of complexity, rewarding players who experimented with multiple trees or who engaged with online communities to learn the system. However, the execution created a situation where the mechanic feels more frustrating than rewarding, as the barriers to success are high and the lack of in-game guidance makes the system feel arbitrary. For some players, this type of hidden complexity is part of what makes Pokemon special. For others, it's a design flaw that should have been explained more clearly. There's a quiet lesson in how these mechanics reflect the series' evolving design philosophy. The honey tree system in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum represents an approach to game design that prioritizes hidden complexity and community-driven discovery, even at the cost of accessibility. Later generations have moved away from this approach, providing clearer guidance and more transparent mechanics, but the legacy of systems like honey trees still shapes how players think about Pokemon's hidden content. These older mechanics serve as a reminder that the series has always been willing to experiment with how it presents information and challenge, even when those experiments don't always land as intended. Another layer of hidden content reveals itself when we turn to the way certain Pokemon have hidden interactions with environmental features that aren't explained through NPC dialogue or tutorials. One such interaction involves the way certain Pokemon can affect the appearance of the overworld when they're in your party. For example, in Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver, having a Pokemon with the ability Illuminate in the first slot of your party causes the screen to brighten slightly when walking through dark areas like caves or nighttime routes. This effect is subtle and easy to miss, but it reflects the developer's attention to thematic consistency, where abilities that logically should affect the environment actually do, even if the effect is purely cosmetic. Another example of environmental interaction involves the way certain Pokémon leave different footprints in the snow when following you in HeartGold and SoulSilver. Most Pokémon leave small, generic footprints, but larger Pokémon like Snorlax and Tyranitar leave visibly larger prints, and flying-type Pokémon that hover above the ground leave no prints at all. These details are never highlighted or explained, existing purely as background elements that add to the immersion and believability of the world. For players who notice these details, they create a sense of wonder and attention to detail for it. Players who don't, they simply blend into the background, unobtrusive but present. These environmental interactions reflect the developer's belief that not every feature needs to serve a mechanical purpose. Sometimes, details are included simply to make the world feel more alive and responsive, to reward players who pay attention, and to add layers of immersion that go beyond gameplay mechanics. The illuminate brightness effect and the varied footprints in snow don't change how you play the game, but they contribute to the sense that the Pokemon world is a place where actions have consequences and where the environment responds to your presence. This type of detail is what separates good games from great ones, adding texture and depth that might not be immediately noticeable, but that accumulates over time to create a richer experience. There's a quiet beauty in discovering these environmental interactions, in realizing that the game has been responding to your choices in subtle ways all along. The footprints in snow and the illuminate brightness effect are small touches, but they demonstrate the care and thoughtfulness that went into creating HeartGold and SoulSilver. These details are easy to overlook, but they're also the kind of thing that players remember years later, the small moments that made the games feel special and alive. They're a reminder that the developers understood what makes Pokemon resonate with players, and they were willing to invest time and effort into details that most people would never consciously notice. As we drift toward the final moments of tonight's journey, it's worth reflecting on what these obscure facts reveal about the Pokemon series as a whole. Each of these details, whether it's an invisible sign, an unused application, a duplicated item, or a hidden environmental interaction, tells a story about the development process and the people who created these games. They're reminders that game development is messy, iterative, and human, filled with choices that seemed logical at the time, but left behind traces of confusion or curiosity. They're evidence that the developers cared deeply about creating a world that felt alive and detailed, even when those details would only be noticed by a handful of dedicated fans. These obscure facts also reveal something about the Pokemon community, about the players who have spent decades exploring every corner of these games, data mining every file, and sharing their discoveries with others. The fact that we know about the invisible sign in Fuchsia City, the unused light switch app, the dual red shard, and all the other details discussed tonight is a testament to the community's dedication and curiosity. These discoveries didn't happen by accident. They happened because players cared enough to look, to experiment, to share, and to keep the conversation alive long after the game's official release dates. That sense of collective discovery is part of what makes Pokémon special, a series that rewards not just individual play, but collaborative exploration and shared knowledge. There's a quiet comfort in knowing that these details exist, that somewhere in the code of every Pokémon game, there are hidden stories waiting to be found. The obscure facts we've explored tonight are just a fraction of what's out there, a small sample of the countless oddities and curiosities that fill the series. For every invisible sign or unused app that gets discovered, there are probably dozens more waiting in the data, silent and patient, ready to surprise the next person who looks closely enough. This sense of endless discovery is what keeps players coming back to Pokémon, what makes each new generation feel like an opportunity to uncover new secrets, and what ensures that the conversation around these games will continue for years to come. As the night deepens and our journey through these obscure facts comes to a close, we're left with a sense of appreciation for the complexity and care that went into creating the Pokémon series. These aren't just games, they're worlds filled with history, personality, and countless small details that reveal themselves slowly over time. The invisible signs, unused code, duplicated items, and hidden interactions we've explored tonight are all part of that larger tapestry, small threads that contribute to the overall richness of the experience. They remind us that Pokémon is more than just catching and battling. It's about exploration, discovery, and the quiet joy of noticing something that most people miss. There's something deeply satisfying about these useless, obscure facts, about knowing that they exist even if they don't change how we play or experience the games. They're reminders that the world is full of hidden details, that not everything needs to serve a purpose, and that sometimes the most interesting things are the ones that were never meant to be found. They're evidence that the developers were human, that they made mistakes and left traces behind, and that those traces have become part of the game's charm and identity. They're a celebration of the messiness and creativity of game development, and a testament to the enduring appeal of a series that continues to surprise us even after all these years. As we move into deeper waters tonight, another layer of curiosity reveals itself when we examine the peculiar behavior of certain game mechanics that seem to defy their own internal logic. One such example appears in the way experience points are calculated and distributed in double battles, a format introduced in Generation 3, where two Pokémon fight side by side against two opponents. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.